Story 1. I always parked in a certain spot at my last job for the 12 years that I was there. It was accessible to the public as it wasn't company parking. But they wanted us to park in the back of the lot, so the closer spots could be available for customers. One day, my spots were taken by a dark-tinted caddy, and I'm immediately pissed because everyone knows it was mine. It's the morning shift, so 4 a.m., so it can't be one of the others. 'Cause I know what they drive. So newbie? Or maybe another employee from another shop in the plaza. It's still there on my lunch break, and when I go home, and the next day I come in at 1 p.m. till closing. Around 9:30. And then also the next. Something about it bothered me. It smelled wrong. It's the South and high summer, and who knows what's baking in there. My dad was a Marine, then a police officer. He always said if you feel something is wrong, there probably is. So I dialed the non-emergency contact police number. I felt like an idiot, but every time I walked by, it bugged me. So I was stuck waiting for over an hour before anyone showed, and honestly, if I hadn't been off the next day, would have been like it. But I waited, mostly because I can be a petty SOB, and that's my spot, damn it. The police show, all annoyed because who knows how many "they can't park here" calls they get. They run the license plate though, and then things go crazy. They want my info, want me to contact my manager, does this lot has cameras, have touched the car, etc. The car is on Amber's alert as the last sighting of a missing person who was a minor, a 15-year-old girl. When they pop the trunk, they find her dead, mutilated body under a blanket and the source of the smell. She had gone out with her much older, controlling, and insecure boyfriend, but had decided to get out of the relationship. She only made the mistake of getting into the car with him. He drove 3 counties over after torturing her, stuffing her in there and who knows what else, then parked and walked away, leaving her to die in the trunk. I never learned her time of death, so it haunts me sometimes to think she might have been saved if I'd made a fuss earlier. So yeah, listen to your gut, even if it seems petty. Story 2. Early to mid-90s in Northern Ireland. I was a kid of around 8 or 9. The sun was shining and it was sometime in the early afternoon. My dad needed to return a library book in the Shankill, a Protestant loyalist area in Belfast. We were Catholics, and the Shankill was notoriously dangerous at the time and still is to a lesser extent. So I was already a little on edge, just knowing the reputation of the place. My dad was cool though, didn't seem worried or anything. It's not like we have Catholic printed on our foreheads. He did say, however, that I had to pretend to have a different name if anyone asked me. My name marks me as a Catholic, so I adopted a Protestant name for the trip. We came to a road that led to an intersection, across which was a predominantly Catholic Republican enclave. We were headed to the right, down a long winding path, but further up the road ahead, towards the intersection, we could see a group of men. One of them was running back and forth across the road, relaying information between 2 pockets of people. Some were staring across the road towards the Catholic area, and some were talking to a man in a parked but running car. One, in particular, stuck out. He had long hair and a leather jacket and was very tall, at least compared to the other men. It all looked suspicious, even to me as a child, although I didn't know why. My dad's demeanor changed to a more serious and quiet one, and I took it as confirmation that we weren't safe. He was from Belfast. We were living in a town outside of Belfast at the time, and grew up when things were at their worst here, so he knew the ropes and knew the signs that something was happening. We weren't walking toward the men, so it wasn't a problem. We crossed to the right and started walking away. This is when a woman approached us. She was middle-aged with short red hair. She saw us coming and made a purposeful beeline toward us. She seemed preoccupied, nervous. She started grilling my dad immediately, asking who he was and where he was coming from. She was talking in an, I'm trying my best to sound casual, but I'm failing manner. I could feel my entire body beginning to boil with fear, and I felt as though I was mere moments away from being discovered. It was like a horror movie where someone finds themselves in a small town where everyone is in a cult or something, and they're trying to blend in but are drawing suspicion and losing themselves in an ever-increasing paranoia. I suddenly had visions of my dad getting shot and me screaming over his corpse, maybe even getting shot myself despite being a child. The longer my dad and the woman talked, the more I was starting to lose the ability to hear, as though my head was underwater. I was holding my dad's hand and I was struggling to keep a grip because of the sweat pumping out of my palm. I didn't know how or why, but something primal in me recognized that we were in danger. It was clear that she was a part of whatever was going on around the corner and was trying to manage and analyze the flow of foot traffic, especially that of strangers like us. Given that she and we were the only people on the street, she had been doing a good job. She was fishing hard for information about us. My dad played it cool and responded to her questions without really revealing much, doing a much better job of being casual than she was. The area we were from, he explained, was mixed, i.e. Protestant and Catholic, and he feigned displeasure at that fact, trying to signal that he hated Catholics and was somewhat miffed to have to live amongst them without ever actually using those words. It was subtle, and I was terrified that I might need to participate in the conversation, because there was no way I could dance around the truth, as well as my dad was doing. He explained that he was just here to return a book, which he showed her as proof. She asked about me and my name, and I gave her a fake name. She surely read the terror on my face and could hear it in my voice. My dad decided that that was the time to break off and say, "Nice to meet you, all the best," and started walking away with me. I could sense that the woman didn't budge and just stood and stared at us as we walked away. I glanced over my shoulder after about 30 seconds and just caught a glimpse of her turning and walking towards the road where the men were gathered. We rounded a corner and were now at the top of a very long and steep road path with the library at the very bottom of it. The path was fenced on one side, and on the other side was a row of houses. It felt like we were walking deeper into danger, and that we had only two routes of escape: keep going or turn back the way we came. About partway down the road, we realized we were being followed. My dad told me to run ahead and check that the library was open, and I hesitated. He said it was okay and to just go and check. I glanced over my shoulder. It was the man in the leather jacket with long hair. I did what my dad wanted and ran ahead, heart pounding and ears pricked, awaiting the crack of gunfire. I checked the door was open, and I ran back up. As I was coming back, I saw that the man in the leather jacket had turned and was making his way back up the road. My dad looked unfazed, but was walking with a certain rigidity, as something had happened in the time it took me to run to the library and back again. And he hadn't quite unclenched his fists yet. He said it was okay, and we were safe. I asked about the man following us. He said he sent me ahead, and when I was a safe distance away, he stopped and turned around to face him, ready for whatever happened. He said he was expecting violence, but as he turned around, the leather jacket dude immediately put his head down, turned, and walked back the way he came. My dad watched him for a few seconds and then started making his way back toward me. That afternoon, within the hour we were there, a Catholic taxi driver was murdered in that street. The vibes that something terrible was going to happen were justified, and I've never felt as terrified as I did that day. When the news about the taxi driver was on TV that night, I knew I had seen the planning of a murder, and I knew we had walked into the middle of it. I could probably have identified both the woman and the leather jacket man had I been asked about them by the police, but that was never going to happen. No way my dad would have volunteered himself, and therefore me, to the cops to be a witness against a terrorist's cell. Story 3. I was born and raised in the southern U.S., but decided to move to Minnesota back in the early 2000s. I moved up there with the original intent of going to the University of Minnesota, as they supposedly had a good atmospheric science program, and I knew people that lived in the state and no one in Oklahoma, or I'd have gone there. Ended up not going to college and just living with friends. I started dating a Canadian girl, and my home was a 4-hour drive from the border up the Minnesota Arrowhead. It was just after Christmas that year, and I was heading back after spending time with my then girlfriend. It was around dusk when I left. Her house was an hour from the border. Crossed back with no problem, and started driving down Highway 61 like I've done dozens of times before. For those not familiar, this highway runs right along Lake Superior and is only traveled that late by those who live there in the few double-digit populated towns and truckers going from Duluth, Superior to Thunder Bay. The weather was clear and the roads were clear, so I sailed at 60 mph like usual. Well, The road was clear until I hit a patch of black ice. I completely lost control and sailed off the highway. I didn't know if I'd go into the woods on one side or partially frozen Lake Superior on the other. Luckily, I went toward the woods, barrel rolled a few times, and landed on my wheels. I was in a shallow ravine, so my car was hard to see unless you were looking for it. I think it was single-digit temperatures outside. This was before the ubiquity of cell phones. There was zero signal where I crashed, so I was alone, freezing, and on a desolate highway near a patch of black ice that could make someone else sail right into me. I'm not sure how long I was out there, but eventually a local found me and took me to the hospital. I somehow escaped with a few cuts and bruises from the crash, and other than that, and being very cold, I was okay. The state police officer who was at the crash scene when we got back to my car said by all accounts I should have died. If not directly from the crash, then from becoming a meat popsicle. I had no way of contacting my friends or my girlfriend, and I was at least a 4 hours drive from home. The local that found me offered a place to stay until someone could come to get me. I was there for 3 days until a friend in Duluth was able to come to get me. His name was John, and I'll never ever forget him. He died in 2018 at 70 years old. I had long since moved back to the South, but kept in touch with him by email. After I crashed, I was in a place I didn't know, at night, on a road that's not traveled much, that late, in winter, freezing. Every moment that passed without a car or semi passing by, I thought I would freeze to death. I was terrified. But then John came along and saved my life, and for that, I'll be eternally thankful. Story 4. We were on a vacation at Lake Tahoe, and long story short, down a winding road you're led to the lake. And I'm the distance we see the same tree we saw our dad in pictures during our childhood. We started running towards it. My older and younger brother, my sister and my cousin were all there, but my cousin and sister stayed behind. My brother and I walked to the brink of it, and as you know, Lake Tahoe is one of the clearest lakes in the world. You can see the bottom, the twigs and roots and everything. My younger brother watched us up on this huge, long, thick, rotting log. I ask my brother if I can jump off of it, and he says maybe. He remembers the water at the bank didn't feel too cold, so he says, sure. I look at the bottom of the lake and count down. 1, 2, 3. I hesitate but jump in. I'm under for a moment, and it feels refreshingly cold. I swim to stay afloat, but all of a sudden I start sinking. I gasp and panic and scream my brother's name, the sheer panic in his eyes, wondering if he should jump in and risk both of us drowning. I swim over, grab onto the branches of the tree, and try to stay afloat. Everything is numb, and I'm in utter shock. He helps me climb up and get off. I'm shaking and freezing. My legs and some parts of my stomach are scratched, bleeding, and beginning to bruise badly. I reach the bottom, and fallen debris on the bottom cut me on impact. Walking back, we were talking about it, and I burst out sobbing. I thought for a second maybe my reality from that moment on was my brain trying to distract me from the fact I had died drowning. I got home, took a shower, and I can't stand the lake since. Story 5. About a month ago, I was staying in a room on the bottom floor of a hotel on a work trip in Ukiah, California. At about 3 in the morning, I'm woken out of a dead sleep by someone pounding on my hotel window, screaming bloody murder, very obviously trying to break through. Because my brain wasn't quite awake yet, for some reason I thought they were gunshots and immediately hit the deck. Once I realized what was happening, I grabbed my firearm I carry for work and just stood there in my underwear in absolute terror, waiting for whatever was about to come through that window. What made it worse was the sounds this person was making didn't sound human. The screams and moans almost sounded animalistic, and no distinguishable words were being said. The screams turned into crying then, back to anger, all while continuing to pound on my window as hard as they could. I didn't want to turn on the lights, as I didn't want them to know someone was in that room and entice them even more to come in. I phoned the front desk to let them know what was happening, and the sweet old lady told me she would take care of it, which I could only assume meant calling the police. Eventually, the person gave up and moved on, I assumed because either security or law enforcement took care of it. After about 20 minutes, I went out to ask her the result, and she stated, "Well, by the time I went out there to chase them off, I didn't see anyone. The homeless like to congregate at the Walmart across the street. So yeah, the rooms closest to there tend to get pretty noisy." I was like, "Damn it, Mabel. If I had known you were going to go out there alone, I would have just handled it myself. You're insane." It's one thing when I'm in work mode and uniform. I have no problem dealing with that. But when I'm caught off guard, at my most vulnerable, it's a completely different feeling. Needless to say, I don't stay on the first floor of hotels anymore. Story 6. When I was about 8, I was deep in the woods at my uncle's house. The parents went out and the 5 kids, 414, stayed home. We were playing a hide-and-seek game in the house with no lights on. There weren't street lights or anything, so you couldn't see anything at all. The base was in the living room, and I hid in the living room so I could quickly get to the base. My brother, aged 11, was it. He was doing his countdown, and I was hiding just a couple of feet from him when a lightning strike drew our attention to the window. We were both shocked to see the outline of a man at the window trying to see in. We started whispering, and on the next lightning strike, the guy was starting to walk to the front door. My brother Ben quickly ran to lock the front door and got there right before the guy started shaking the handle. Ben started flipping on the lights, presumably, so the guy would know people were home and he'd leave, and he yelled for me to lock the other doors. I ran and locked the kitchen door, and then to the sliding glass door at the back of the house. As I was locking that door, the guy was suddenly there, standing there on the other side of the glass. I was frozen, but Ben calmly told me to close the curtain, and I focused on his voice and did what he said. My uncle has guns, but his son was gone on a hunting trip, so all we could find was a BB gun that looked like a real rifle. Ben stepped out on the porch with it to try to make the guy believe we were armed. They constantly had phone issues, this is going way back, but they had a party line and we couldn't get the phone to work to make a call. We were trying to call someone on my uncle's CB radio, but weren't getting anyone. Eventually, an older cousin, who was only like 15 himself, showed up, and we thought an adult was there, and we had been saved. That calmed us down, and we went back to normal, I guess. I'm not sure I've ever had a creepier moment than looking up at the window and seeing someone on the other side, though. Story 7. I can't remember how old I was, but was definitely not older than 10 or younger than 8, but now I'm still traumatized from it. As a black man growing up in the mid-50s through the 60s, Dad suffered a lot of abuse, both at home and outside of it. He even ended up joining the Vietnam War at the very end, fresh out of high school. Because of this, he developed a heavy drinking and drug problem that I wasn't fully aware of as a child. As you can probably guess, this led him to be abusive himself, mostly towards my mom. I don't remember a lot of my childhood because I blacked a lot of it out, but there are only a couple of nights I'll never forget. A little more backstory: I was and am the youngest sibling and was named after him before changing it myself. So I didn't really endure a lot of the physical abuse myself. And for the most part, I was always quiet and just tried to stay out of trouble. On to the story, though. It was a normal Saturday night. My siblings and I were watching TV. My dad was with his brother somewhere drinking. And surprisingly, my mom was at a neighbor's, a single older woman, just enjoying herself. A couple of weeks before this, my dad ended up getting hurt at work and was on some pretty strong pain pills, so I'm guessing that the large amount of alcohol and possibly heavy drug use led to what happened next. The next moments are a little fuzzy, but from what I remember, my parents both ended up home and began arguing very loudly with my dad, accusing my mom of cheating on him. I remember we had this big glass table in our living room, and he was so pissed off he slammed his fists on it and shattered it. After that, it all turned physical, as he began attacking my mom. She did fight back, though, while myself and my brother just stood there crying our eyes out, begging them to stop. At some point, my sister, about 13, jumped on him, and he tossed her into a door, actually breaking it like it was nothing. During all of this, my dad's brother, who was in his 60s or 70s, was trying to talk him down, but it was like nothing was getting to him. Eventually, my dad walked out the door, and my mom sat us all on the couch and just held us while we cried, thinking it was finally over, until my dad came back in and started pouring some liquid over all of us. It was gasoline, and we didn't even realize it until he poured a line outside the door and started trying to light it, with a lighter that I'm still thankful wasn't working. My sister ran out the back door to another of my dad's siblings who lived a couple of blocks away. My uncle was able to stop him from trying to burn us all alive, and when he came back in, I just remember grabbing him by the waist and begging him to stop and saying I had gas in my eyes. I think at that point it broke him out of whatever came over him, because he just began apologizing and checking to see if I was hurt, then he ran off. The thing is, though, the worst part isn't that my mom didn't press charges or that he was only in jail over the weekend. It's the fact he doesn't remember any of it while I think about it almost every day. I do still have a relationship with my dad, though, albeit strained. He is completely sober now and an amazing grandparent to my siblings' kids whom he sees every day. Although he's part of the reason I don't think I could ever have kids. I'm not good at storytelling, so I'm sorry if it gets a little hard to read. I can further explain anything, though. Story 8. I was on active duty in the Navy, served aboard a submarine. We were in port one day, and most of the crew had left. The guys on duty for the night that's us were permitted to bring our kids on board for dinner. Halfway through the meal, someone makes a 4MC announcement. 4MC is the emergency announcement intercom thing, says there's light smoke in the engine room, quickly followed by fire in the engine room. We train for this stuff religiously, so everyone is immediately in action. The commanding officer is still there, but topside. One of our senior enlisted guys ran the kids up front to a hatch where he was, quite literally, throwing them through the hatch as our CO caught them and set them on the deck topside. The rest of us ran toward the fire and I saw no one grabbing a mask, not one person. So I grabbed a big handful of breathing masks and followed through the hatch where we were greeted by what appeared to be a light smoke filling the entire engine room. But it didn't smell like smoke. It was sweet, tasted sweet. An oil pump had blown and filled the entire back half of the boat with atomized hydraulic fluid. A guy was moments from lighting a torch in the engine room as the casualty was called. Had it been called just a moment later, we'd have walked into an inferno. Had he, for some reason, not heard it called and lit the torch when after we had run in, we'd have been on fire before we could react. Turned out perfectly fine. Cleaned the oil that clung to all the surfaces and fixed the pump. But it was somewhat surreal, understanding just how close we were to a wildly different result. Story 9. I live in a relatively peaceful country, but back when COVID was at its peak, our economy got really bad, so there was a lot of increased crime. One day, my friend and I were walking Sunday at around 4 or 5 in the evening, and it was a stroll we had done before. There weren't that many cars on the road, but that was pretty normal for the daytime it was. So as we're walking, 2 guys walk up to us, and one of them pulls out a gun. Ask us to hand over everything in our pockets. Now, for some odd reason, I had carried both the old phone I had and my new phone. I can't say why, but I left the house with both because I had a feeling I would need them. I gave him my old phone and my friend handed hers over. He looks at my new phone and asks for it. I refused because TBH I just got the phone, and I was more afraid of my dad who had bought it than the robber. He points the gun right at my head and says, "I'm gonna kill you if you don't." I still refused. Honestly, it was the dumbest, bravest thing I've ever done. The guys look up and see that cars are coming, hop on a motorcycle and drive away. My friend immediately starts having a panic attack. Some guy in his car sees us and pulls over, asking if we're fine, what's wrong, etc. I explained the situation and he asked if he could drop us home. Honestly, maybe not our smartest idea, but we got in, and he dropped us off. It was a 2-minute drive from her house, but she lives in a somewhat secluded area. The shock of what just happened then hits me, and I start to panic, crying, wondering if that was how I would have died. To this day, anytime someone approaches me on the street or calls out to me to stop, my panic goes into an intense override, and I just run off. Story 10. I was at my friend's house for the night to celebrate his birthday. We were 10. We wanted to camp outside the house on the lawn, so we set up tents and separated the girls and boys. We stayed up past midnight just playing board games and talking when the girls started trying to scare us by slapping the tent. We went out to check, and all we could hear laughing from the girls' tent, so we did the same. This went on for about 20 minutes, then everyone decided to go to bed. We were almost asleep when we heard the girls scream. They thought we were pushing on the tent again, but we weren't. Then, the same thing happened to us. We just brushed it off as we thought the girls would be getting us back for something we didn't do. But then at the same time, both our tents started caving in, like something was pushing from all directions. We all screamed and ran inside. From that point on, we were all terrified, constantly hearing noises like knocking on walls and footsteps, etc. I don't remember how long it lasted, but we all eventually passed out and woke up the next morning trying to figure out an explanation for the tents and the noises. But we couldn't. Everything about the night wasn't adding up to any conclusion we came to. A couple of side points. 1. My friend lived on a farm in the middle of nowhere, so it's unlikely it was people messing with us. 2. The farmhouse is also on a hill with no trees nearby, so it couldn't have been wild animals pushing on the roof. 3. My friend's parents are religious and always go to bed at the same time every night. They could have messed with us, but it didn't seem right. 4. My friend was also the oldest child in his family, so he didn't have any older siblings to mess with us. I still have questions about that day, and it still puzzles me 12 years later, but it was one of the scariest experiences of my life.